Thank you for joining us on this episode of Legal Angle with Emmanuel Olawale. Today, we are going to explore the roles of prosecutors in the legal system. My guest today is a career prosecutor with over 25 years' experience. He is Bill Hedrick. Welcome to the show, Bill.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here today.
Can you tell us a bit more about yourself?
All right. I'm originally from a small town in southern Indiana. The town's called Washington. It's in southwestern Indiana. It's a very rural area. I was the first member of my family or extended family to go to college. I went to junior college is how I started out. I planned on being a business major. Obviously, I moved off of that and then I sort of really did all kinds of academic stuff at that point. So I went from a family with no college degrees. I got an associate's degree from the junior college. Then I got a bachelor's degree from Purdue University. And I was going to be a social studies teacher at that point. I'd switched majors. And then I ended up not doing that either. So then I ended up going to 1 year of graduate school at Purdue for history. And then I transferred to Indiana University and I actually got a master's degree in library science. So I was a librarian. I worked as a professional librarian for 3.5 years. I actually got that degree at Indiana, but then I got a job at Purdue. So while I was at Purdue working as a librarian, I finished a master's degree that I had been working on in history. I worked there 3.5 years and I actually decided after all that, I want to go to law school. So my family's about ready to give up hope that I was ever going to pick a profession, but I was working while I was going to school. So I applied to 10 law schools and I was very fortunate. I got accepted to the Ohio State College of Law. At the time, it was the Ohio State College of Law. It wasn't the Moritz College of Law. So I'd only been to Columbus once. I had never even seen the law school. So I came here sight unseen and I moved to Columbus. Loved Columbus. I loved my experience in law school. While in law school, I was president of the Student Bar Association, so I was real active in the law school. Originally, when I went to law school, I had I think we have grandiose dreams of what we're going to do when we go to law school. I think we all think we're going to be the top of the class. We're all going to be on journal. We're going to do all these things. A month in, I figured out that's probably wasn't going to be me. I originally wanted to do civil rights law, employment law. My legal idol was lawyer Morris Dees, and Morris Dees actually created the Southern Poverty Law Center, and he was famous because he had sued and bankrupted the Ku Klux Klan in a couple places in the United States. So that was sort of my legal idol, and that's who I sort of wanted to be. Unfortunately, he's had some things happen in his career since then that has discredited some of his work, but that work in particularly drew me to law school. Again, after I started law school, the path didn't end up being the same. So while I was in law school, one of my classmates described working at the night prosecutor program, particularly doing mediations and then intake, and it appealed to me. So I volunteered with Judge Taylor with the Municipal Court. So I was a volunteer with her for about a year. And then I got a position as a mediator at the night prosecutor program, where I mediated neighborhood disputes for a year and a half. I actually had 110 full mediations. It was really interesting. It was challenging. What I liked most about the work, it was hands-on with people. It was always interesting. And I found out like a lot of the other stuff in law school was sort of boring. And I didn't want to be one of those people who was bored when I practiced law. So I then went on to become an intake officer in the prosecutor's office, which an intake officer is a person that helps citizens file criminal complaints that want to file charges. Often they don't get charges, but one of the things you do, you go over with them what other options they have, such as protection orders, mediations, small claims court, and you also gather the evidence to see there's enough evidence to file charges. So literally that experience led to a 27-year tie to the Columbus City Attorney's Office. Janet Jackson was the city attorney at the time, and she gave me my first job as an assistant city prosecutor. So I started doing a regular docket for several years. And then I also was assigned to the environmental court for 3 years. So I did that for 3 years, which is, if those who are not familiar with environmental court, that's housing, zoning, overweight trucks, animal complaints, a lot of things that are quality of life issues in neighborhoods and communities. And I dealt with those. It was a large volume of people. Often they didn't even have an attorney. So not only was I the prosecutor, I had to talk to all the defendants and try to work out those cases. And that was with, at the time, was Judge Pfeiffer, who created the court. And he had a very hands-on approach. He actually never even took the bench. He just sat at a table and the defendants appear before him. We often would go out to the field for hearings. So I think I learned a lot of that in that courtroom on how to deal with people. Then I went back into the courtroom for another couple of years. And then I became, in the management in the office, I became the head of the intake department, the unit I started in, taking criminal complaints. I did that for 3 or 4 years, and then I became the deputy chief prosecutor. And when Mr. Pfeiffer became city attorney in 2010, he actually made me chief of staff for the entire office. So I was working as chief of staff, and I still retained my title as the deputy chief prosecutor. When City Attorney Klein came in, I served for a little under a year and a half as his chief prosecutor. And then the last year, I went back into the courtroom after many years, and I was the lead senior prosecutor. So it was particularly a good experience for me going to run for judge, because I'd been in management for a number of years, and I'd made some appearances here and there on cases, but I hadn't actually done a docket for a really, really long time. So it was a really good experience. I was practicing in front of Judge Pollitt, and that was also great at the time. He was one of the few judges that was on the bench when I started as a prosecutor. So unfortunately, he got COVID, but that experience while he was there was really good for me. I sort of got back in the swing, and I like to say it regave me my street cred, because it got me back in the courtroom, and it also let me see defense attorneys again. Actually, people don't like to hear me say that. Maybe people in the prosecutor's office don't either. I actually thought it was easier when I went back into the courtroom to be a courtroom prosecutor than when I started. There's a variety of reasons. When I started as a prosecutor, we handled a large number of the domestic violence cases, and now the DV team handles those. All the automation, I think, also make things a lot easier. So I actually thought, going back into the courtroom, I mean, it wasn't a total cakewalk, but I think electronic discovery, I mean, there were lots of things that were improved. So I think that was a good experience for me. I think it was also helpful for me, given that I'm running for judge. I can now say, again, I had that experience, even though I'd had it before.
Oh, wow. So you've worked as a librarian, you've worked as a mediator, you've worked diverse jobs even before you got to where you are. How does it feel to be the first member of your family to have a college degree, and even a post-college degree, which is the professional degree, JD?
I mean, I think it's very special to me. I mean, obviously, luckily, we've had some family members since then that have graduated. My nieces have gone to college, but I did have one cousin that went to college prior to me. I think some of the family don't know quite how to interact with me, because I think they think, because of my education, I'm going to act like I'm a different person. You know, we all have a job. People in the courthouse know my legal name is actually Billy Ray. So you'll often hear people call me Billy Ray. And I'm fine with that, because I think the reason I do that, actually, when I graduated from law school, they wanted to announce me as William. And I'm like, my name is not William. I had them announce me as Billy Ray, because I wanted people to know someone with that name and that background was graduating from law school. And not only that, at the time, I was president of the student body, and we actually had Janet Reno as our guest speaker. So I actually got to spend a big chunk of the day and my graduation with Janet Reno. And for somebody from my background, my family came, and they actually, because I was the speaker and president of the student body, were actually seated in the front row. So that was an incredible experience for me to share with them. There's a couple other fun things that happened over the years. I did run for judge in 2004. I did not succeed, but my family was here. And what was really interesting, we were in my hotel room and they just left. Somebody brought in Jerry Springer who came to visit my room. So that was like something funny that my family got to talk about. So my family's very proud of me, but also I go back home. I still maintain connections with people I went to school with, and I try to remember where I came from. And I hope it doesn't change the person that I was or that I want to be.
Thank you. It's always good to remember where you came from. That is your foundation, that is your source, and that is your source of life. Yeah, let's talk about our prosecutors and their role in the legal system. Prosecutors are one of the most powerful lawyers in the legal system, and that is because they have the power to either grant people's freedom or take away people's freedom. They could either decide to dismiss a case or recommend lighter sentences or go for the jugular, or they could decide that a defendant has to be imprisoned or sentenced to death. Some prosecutors take their job as a crusade. So they see it as a battle where every case, regardless of the fact, regardless of the evidence, must be won. So they become persecutors. So they want to make sure someone gets to go to jail or get in prison or sentenced to death regardless. Like the case we see with the prosecutor in the Central Park Five, and the one in Ohio, the Cleveland Four. So these prosecutors often get innocent people in prison or sent to death rows. And most of the victims of this anomaly or miscarriage of justice are people of color. As a career prosecutor, what are your thoughts about these prosecutors who are meant to fight for to get justice for the state, who become prosecutors?
Okay.
What are your thoughts about those?
Well, first of all, I will answer the question based on my experience. I can't speak for other people or other prosecutors' office or how other people conduct themselves. I will say I have been a career prosecutor. I'm also a misdemeanor career prosecutor, which is a less serious level of charges. So typically, even if I were the most aggressive prosecutor on the face of the earth, a lot of people in misdemeanor courts do not go to jail. So it's a lot of volume. So again, I can't tell you how other people have done their profession. One of the things I did, my background, obviously, when I told you what inspired me to go to law school, is I would be considered probably more liberal than a lot of people. And especially when I was in law school, I was in the Lawyers Guild, I was in a lot of the activist groups in the law school. And I always thought one of the issues I had is people who are particularly liberal are like, oh, I want to be a public defender, but none of them ever want to be prosecutors. And I think it's important if you come sometimes from a more liberal perspective to actually become a prosecutor, because I think we can influence what happens more. Because a lot of the time, attorneys are arguing me to try to get me to do things. And I'm like, the prosecutor is the one who actually has the power to often do them. So I think that's important, and I've tried to maintain that perspective when I became a prosecutor. I've also been very fortunate. I've worked for 3 elected officials that were city attorneys, and none of them, I can truly say, none of them were like, hey, let's go out for convictions and let's go after people. In fact, when I started, it was under City Attorney Jackson, and she was the first African-American female city attorney we had ever had. She was the first African-American judge in municipal court. And, she made it very clear to us what her expectations were as us as prosecutors on how we were to treat people. We would have training. I think particularly those of us who come from certain backgrounds, we all need to be aware that, I may have come from Southern Indiana. It may be, we weren't rich people, but I still have a certain amount of privilege based on being a white male. I recognize that. And I think that's important. One recognizes that we treat everyone equally, but we don't all start from the same place. And that also culturally, we are all taught, whether we know it or not, and we may not even know we're taking in these thoughts, certain biases that we need to work through. And I've, again, been fortunate that I've worked with 3 city attorneys that were all very clear that they wanted everyone to be treated equally. They would have no ground, if there's any discrimination being practiced in that office, those 3 city attorneys would not have stood for it. And they were all very vocal about that. So beyond that was already my belief system already. I have never felt pressure that you got to go for win and you got to get a conviction. Now, there are cases we do that. People also have to keep in mind, sometimes they make it out like the prosecutors are the bad guys. We're also helping the victims. And victims need a voice too. So we're there to treat the defendants fairly, but at the same time, you also have to look out for the interest of the victims. And, our victims come from a certain aspect too. I mean, if I have someone who has no license, no insurance, and they have a wreck with someone in their community, somebody be like, well, that's not that big of a deal. No one was hurt. Well, what if that victim, that's the car that's getting their children to school? That's how they're getting to their job. And they don't have the economic resources to get another car, even if I get them the deductible. Someone needs to keep that in mind too. So I think as a prosecutor, we can be an advocate for justice in that way. Also, if we see something that is not fair, if I see a police officer do something I don't agree with, I've reported it. And we have that ability. We also have the ability to tell the officer or whoever, I'm like, this case is bad for whatever reason. I'm going to dismiss it. So a lot of those things that you say that you see in prosecutors, I have never seen. I mean, I will say when we start, I think a lot of people, I think both defense attorneys and prosecutors may be a little overzealous and a little overly eager when you start your job. Am I the same person or prosecutor as when I started? No, because we also learn as we go. And I think that's one of the important things, that you also do not lock yourself in preconceived notions. Even at my age and at this point in my experience, and even if I'm an elected judge, I'm like, look, there are things I did differently 10 years ago than what I'm going to do now. So you have to be open. Now, luckily with a misdemeanor, I don't have to worry. I cannot truly say, look, I convicted somebody of something they did not do. They spent many, years in jail. There's other things I've done. I mean, I've had people that used to call my office. I was always known as, if someone called the front desk and it sounded like they needed help with something and no one knew where to send them, that was sent to my phone line, because people knew I would listen and I would try to help people. An example, when I was at the city attorney's office, we created an identity theft program. And what that was, we often had people call the office and they'd be like, I have all these things on my record and I didn't do it. And you'd find out they had a relative, a cousin, a brother, someone who had went on, a criminal tear, but had used their ID and who'd actually pled. In the past, these people were said, oh, you got to go hire an attorney to clean that up. I'm like, why should they hire an attorney? They didn't do anything. So we would actually do the background. I get slate pictures. I get the picture of the person who said it wasn't them. We compare, and we'd remove those things off these people's records for no cost. I, as a prosecutor, had the power to do that. And we did that for hundreds of people. So I think there's a lot of good things that we can do. So a lot of those abuses I hear about are not abuses I truly have seen. In fact, of the years, even in management, the only thing that would get someone in trouble as a prosecutor is if you were like way, way too lax, where you didn't seem like you cared about your job, or you were being overly zealous to the point that it just was not, if you have somebody come in municipal court and they have 10 theft charges, you can only stack the charges to a certain point, So saying you want somebody to plead to 10 charges when you know you can't get sentenced for more than 4 is not something that we would want. Another thing we always stress is if we would work with people, if you came in with no license and you got a valid license and now you're insured, often we would encourage people to dismiss those for court costs. Now, ultimately, at the city attorney's office, in my experience, the prosecutors, though, did have a lot of personal discretion. So it also depends on what prosecutor you have. And also, as you know, when you practice in the court, each one of the judges is very different as well. So there may be some judges that would sentence something more harshly than I would. We just sort of work with that. The other thing I think that's important when you're a prosecutor, and sometimes it can be difficult, is to listen to what the defense attorney has to say. Because now, sometimes a defense attorney, there's some defense attorneys, every client is completely and totally innocent and they will have theatrics for every case. I don't think they're serving their client well, because at that point, when they do that every time, when they do have a case where they have some really valid points, sometimes the prosecutors just learn to shut that out because they've heard this from them so many times. So I think we all develop a relationship, and if somebody says, Bill, can you look at these things? We would always look at those things. And if I thought there was something that would vindicate a person to let them off, we would dismiss the case, because I would never want to convict somebody for something they didn't do. I always say it's better for a guilty person to go free than for an innocent person to go to jail. But again, with misdemeanors, there's a little bit less pressure. So we don't have these nightmare scenarios where I found out somebody I convicted at the beginning of my career is still in jail and ended up being innocent. Or even worse, someone who's really guilty and you can't make the case gets off with a very serious charge. So I think I've just been lucky, given the level of crime or charges I dealt with and the office holders I have worked with. Like I said, particularly when City Attorney Pfeiffer was a judge, he would literally sit at a table and he would have the prisoners sit across from him and actually talk to them. So I was always taught that we humanized people. One time I had a public defender, I said, they didn't know me that well, and I said, well, does your client have a drug problem? And they're like, well, they're back in the holding cell. If you want to ask them, go ask them. That's fine with me. I went back there because I think they thought that I wouldn't go back in the holding tank. And I'm like, I don't have a problem going in the holding tank. And unfortunately for them, I asked their client, I said, do you have a drug problem? And again, they were there with me. And the guy's like, yeah, I want help. So we figure out a way to try to get that help. Now, we don't always succeed. And there are some people that the only solution is a conviction. And sometimes we have to figure out, what type of jail time they should or should not get. But ultimately, that decision is also up to a judge. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit. But like I said, I can say I have found prosecutors in my experience, and the way I've tried to conduct myself, not to fit that stereotype that was in your question.
Thank you. And I love the fact that you encourage liberal-minded people to also go to the prosecutor's office, and how you act as a gatekeeper to make sure that those who are overzealous are reined back. I like that. We're all humans, and as humans, we are fallible. We can make mistakes. We can make errors. Sometimes some of these prosecutorial errors are not intentional. Sometimes they are. And sometimes when these errors are discovered in the future, sometimes the prosecutor involved are reluctant to change the records. What do you think is responsible for this reluctance?
Again, again, it's going to sound like a broken record. I haven't had a lot of those experiences, also because the kind of cases we have, we don't go back and revisit. And often the prosecutors that would have handled those cases because of our turnover wouldn't even still be with the office. Now, I can give you some examples of some things we have done in the past. Luckily, the expungement laws have gotten much more liberal than what they were when I started. Sometimes we could work with defense attorneys. Say, for instance, they had a client that 15 years ago had a drug abuse problem, and they picked up like 5 shoplifting cases all within a couple week period. Under the old statute, they couldn't have got those expunged. So sometimes, we could work with people under selective circumstances and with the cooperation of the judge. I mean, I signed off on some withdrawals from pleas in the past just because that was the only way to sometimes get the person to get their record expunged. I've never had a case that's come back that we've ever had to try to redo or found any evidence that changed anything. And again, I think that's the nature of misdemeanor charges. So unfortunately, this question might be better used for a county prosecutor who actually does felonies, because I just don't see that much on the misdemeanor side, and we don't even have defense attorneys even file appeals to try to reopen records from the past for the most part.
Yeah, it's great that you're answering these questions, because a lot of people out there, especially those who are going to go to the polls, they don't know the difference between a city attorney and attorneys in municipal court and those who try felony cases. All they know is one is a prosecutor. So when they know that you're a prosecutor, they assume that you're one of those prosecutors. So I'm
Yes.
glad that you're answering these questions and letting people know the difference. The difference between what you've done for over 25 years and those who try cases in felony courts. So
and
thank you.
At some point too, you can probably get a county prosecutor or someone with the experience doing that kind of work, because again, as you said, people don't know the difference. And again, I'll reiterate, a misdemeanor prosecutor does anything that's only punishable by up to 6 months or less in jail, and probably honestly 3/4 of what we do is often traffic related. So we do a lot of traffic cases. There are some serious offenses in there, acts of violence, those type of cases. We do handle some serious cases. We're most known for, because particularly in Franklin County, it's the busiest court in the state of Ohio and one of the busiest in the country. So a prosecutor could have anywhere between, I've seen as low as 20, but I've seen as high as 120 cases in one day. And we had to juggle all those cases. The other thing that's also interesting in Franklin County versus a lot of other places, when you check into court, we check you in. We're the maitre d' service. So I think we're unique as a misdemeanor prosecutor. I always tell the public defenders, because I interact with their clients as much as they do, if not more. Also, if someone comes in and they can't get an attorney, they have to deal one-on-one with us. So I deal with a lot of people, and I deal a lot with what would be clients of defense attorneys. I know what they deal with because I have to interact with their clients as well. It's also interesting too, because I'll interact with all the police officers too, and I'm like, they'll be like, well, this is what happened, and this person was unpleasant. And sometimes I'll look at them and I said, well, I saw how they talked to me, so I sort of, yeah. Or I also recognize sometimes when people interact with me, they may not be interacting with me the same way. I've always been sort of surprised that sometimes I've actually had defendants treat me nicer than they treat their attorney sometimes, even though I'm the one that's trying to get them in trouble. Or if they're there on their own, try to explain to them, I'm not your attorney. I'm going to tell you what's going on, but I am not here for your interest, and you need to look at me as the bad guy, even though I think I'm going to treat you fairly. I go to extremes. Like, for instance, if I'm doing a traffic case and the person is representing themselves, I copy the statute. I give them a copy of the statute. I give them a tablet, and I give them a pen. Now, it's usually also to my benefit. Half the time, if they actually read the statute of what they're charged with, they often will just plea out because they just didn't know what the statute said. So I think it's better. Also, if they go to trial, I'm less likely, if they're doing a trial in front of the judge, to object to everything, because I always, these people, they didn't go to law school and they're scared. Most people are not comfortable public speaking. So I'm not there. If you're there with a traffic ticket, you have a right to fight your ticket, and I'm not there to give you a hazing. Now, again, I want to be treated with respect as well, and that's one of the things too. We always have to work to try to make things where they're not personal, either with defense attorneys or with defendants. And as you said before, we're all humans, and sometimes we don't always meet the mark. I mean, I've had situations where I've apologized to people later, but we all have bad days. So you try to have fewer of them than the more.
Yes. There are some cases that start off at the municipal court, being charged as misdemeanor, then they're dismissed and later sent to the grand jury to be indicted. Can you explain to people the process and what kind of cases, why were they brought in the municipal court in the first place? Because a lot of people are, non-lawyers are confused about situations such as that.
I'll be honest with you, I sometimes get confused by it because honestly, again, we don't handle those cases. So the county prosecutor's office handles those. So again, the county prosecutor probably would be more likely to be able to answer that in a more articulate manner. Most of the cases, in my experience, that start out that are going to be felony cases that are sent to be arraigned in municipal court are dismissed. And they're dismissed for what's called a future indictment. And what that means is the case is usually prepared by the county prosecutor to go to a grand jury, and then the charge is reinstated at that point. The problem is, and this is my experience, and again, I don't practice in that area, is sometimes when something gets dismissed for a future indictment, it's sort of just hanging there over your head. So you don't know when it may go to the grand jury, and sometimes it may not go to the grand jury at all. And, how long do you sit out there? Are they going to file this charge against me or not? And so I think that's one of the shortcomings of that. I think the other shortcoming is if you were charged or that case, it's problematic for our office because if there's a victim on a case, they don't understand why it was dismissed. And they often will call the county prosecutor's office and they'll say, well, call the municipal because they're the ones who handled it because it was at municipal. And I'm like, no, we don't handle it. So it's bad for the victims because they get sent back and forth calling each side. And also the problem with it being dismissed. And because I am the city prosecutor, I don't know who to refer them to the county prosecutor's office when they're a victim to ask questions. So they'll often call our office very upset because the case has been dismissed, and I'll be explaining to them I'm like, look, it's probably not dismissed. It's just going to be refiled at a different time. Sometimes they're not refiled too because what they do is they'll work with the defendant, to do a drug program or other things to keep from actually filing the charge. So I don't know. It's sort of a weird hybrid that this comes through municipal court. I mean, it's very interesting too, in the municipal court judges. That's one of the things running for judge that's going to be interesting for me. I'm going to have to set bonds on felony cases, but I've never done felony cases. So, and then those bonds can just be turned around and be reset by county judges or felony judges if they decided that the municipal judge set a bond that they didn't think was appropriate. I don't know how that work split occurred. I don't think it's the most efficient one.
Thank you, because there's a lot of confusion with defendants and even victims, and you clarify that. In 2004, you nicknamed a defendant as a demolition derelict. It was a 24-year-old reckless driver accused of causing 3 accidents over a 30-minute period. How did you come up with such an apt description?
Well, we went through a time period where I highlighted a lot of warrants for people that had outstanding warrants, particularly on misdemeanors. And as you know, misdemeanors are lower crimes, so they're not quite as exciting. So we would come up with names for these people. Now, I was very selective on who we picked. We would only pick people that had extensive records. That were refusing to come to court. And then we would usually try to come up with a nickname. And I had a staff member that would help too. We'd run by them based on the crime and what they were charged with. And, so we did press releases and we would send these out, and they actually got a lot of attention. If you run my name, Prosecutor Bill Hedrick, fugitive files on the internet, you'll just get hit after hit. I mean, we had some fellow that had a blue stripe that went down the side of his face, and I thought it looked like Mel Gibson from Braveheart. So we called him the Braveheart Bandit. We had another individual. Unfortunately, they had a drug problem, but they were shoplifting a lot, and they made the mistake that they stole the Downton Abbey DVD set. So I called them the Downton Abbey Addict. That actually was picked up nationally. Now, I will say some of these things are like, well, that wasn't fair to those people. Like, one, there were circumstances where they were not coming to court. If I even had an address, I'd even send a letter and say, you need to come and take care of this warrant. But two, sometimes the attention actually helped them, because the gentleman who was the Downton Abbey addict, he had just come through the system multiple times, and the attention he got because of that actually led to him being put into a drug treatment program, because he was falling between the cracks. And there was actually the Daily News online through New York actually did an extensive story about him and his background and his history and his heroin use and information from his family. None of that would have happened if we hadn't done the highlight, because he just would have been another name and number. So even though at some point people were like, you're really picking and beating up on these people, but also like the guy, the Demolition derelict, I'm like, he hit like 3 or 4 people's cars within a couple-hour period, and I'm like, you need to go to court for that. Now, we avoided violent offenders, just because there's also victims involved in that, and it was just a different equation. So most of the ones I did usually dealt with theft and driving. And the theft, we focused a lot. We had one guy, we call him the paleo diet pilfer. He stole meat, and he didn't like that name. A lot of them didn't like their names, so I'm like, I was glad they didn't like their names. And honestly, even when we put it out there, I gave out my phone number to the office. So often many of these defendants would call me directly, and we would arrange for them to have a safe surrender and come in and deal with their case, because again, they weren't usually violent offenders. I had a few that called and said, one lady was like, I don't like you called me all these things and stuff. I'm like, you've been charged with shoplifting 20 times. Just don't do it anymore, and you don't have to worry about this. So also, I think it also highlighted the work that we were doing, even though, I had some people that would, because again, they don't know the difference between the county prosecutor and the city prosecutor. And they're like, there's murderers and there's rapists and there's drug dealers and all this stuff. I'm like, why is he highlighting this? And I'm like, these are the most serious charges I deal with. So for me, they are serious, but also, if your car is being broken into and your stuff's being stolen by the individual that's hitting the whole street, that affects a lot of people. Or, even shoplifting, because a lot of people corporate will eat it. Well, if you have a store or a business in an area of the city that's already economically challenged, and they're constantly being hit by a shoplifter, that's going to destroy whatever profit margin there is. And if that's the only store that people, with multiple blocks can get groceries or medicine, and it goes out of business because the profit margin. So it's not a victimless crime, because it does affect other people in that community, or the sheer inconvenience. When no one wants to go to a store and everything's locked up in the back cabinet, and you have to ask for assistance to get it. And you live in that community, and that's the image you see. What does that make you feel about yourself? And so I do think we had fun with these, and we made light of these, but they worked out really well. And I think we ended up, and I don't know if there were any left out there that we didn't get, but pretty well all of them at some point or another were either arrested or turned themselves in. The bulk of them, frankly, because we made it public, they turned themselves in. And if they even called me, we even had on our website how they could call Bar Association to get an attorney. And we also supplied them with the number to the public defender's office. And if any of those individuals were highlighted, if they said they wanted to come in and get their cases back on the docket, we usually didn't oppose that. And again, if a lot of them got treatment, if that's what they needed. Now, some of them did end up going to jail. We did have some people, frankly, they didn't have mental health issues. They didn't have drug issues. They sold for a living. That's what they did. So we lined them up. You're a professional thief. This is what you do for a living. And some of those people, if jail time, if we can get the price high enough, you'll stop doing it, because they also knew a misdemeanor stopped at $1,000, and we could get people that would be $999.98. They knew it to the penny. So.
Yeah. Oh, great. Even that idea of public shaming is a form of punishment by itself.
Yeah.
So that that can discourage further crimes.
And the best part is, and we did find out, because I would put my number out there for tips. The other reason, if they didn't call themselves, family members, or like all things, an ex. The exes would call me all the time, and not only would they tell me where they're at, they tell me all the other stuff they've been doing too. So it only highlighted to me that this probably wasn't a very nice person. So I was okay with it.
Thank you. And I would like you to educate people listening or watching out there the difference between a county prosecutor and a city prosecutor, because a lot of people don't know the difference.
All right. The county prosecutors deal with felonies, which are the more serious charges. So typically when you watch a TV show that involves a courtroom and somebody being prosecuted, that's a county prosecutor. So those are things that could be punished with imprisonment, most drug charges, murder, rape, all the more serious crimes. A city prosecutor deals with the more lower level crimes. So it's usually anything that's punishable up to 6 months in jail or less. So the most serious charges would be like domestic violence, if you have no prior record, assaults that don't lead to serious injuries, but it's still an assault, petty theft, drunk driving, most of your driving offenses, hit skip, some vehicular homicide. So if there's an accident and someone's killed, but somebody wasn't drunk when they did it or something, it was just a really bad accident, maybe somebody was speeding, that would land on our docket. Environmental cases go to environmental court, so housing, zoning, animal charges, a lot of traffic cases. So mostly lower level crimes, but those things I threw out were the bulk of them. Sometimes things pop up that you don't think of, like licensing cases, underage drinking, underage sales, those types of things. So like liquor violations also come to the court. The standard things are usually traffic, theft, and assaults, and domestic violence. That usually globs up most of the types of cases you get. There's a few other things out there. In misdemeanor court too, and this is something we also have to always explain to victims. And this is sometimes I also explain when people are involved in criminal justice reform. I felt as a whole, Franklin County has had a pretty progressive bench. It may have changed from when I started. We had some judges when I started that, if you were charged with no license, you'd spend significant amounts of time in jail. We don't have a lot of judges like that. So often I had to tell victims, I'm like, look, this person, they have these stereotypes, they're going to go to prison or they should go to prison for a long period of time. And I'm like, that doesn't usually happen with misdemeanors. Often if you got like a 10-day sentence on a theft case, I'm the prosecutor, that's often considered, for our end, a really good sentence. Whereas, the victim of theft may say, oh my gosh, you didn't do your job. It should have been more. So we always have to explain to people it's a balancing act. It's also, I like misdemeanor court, and it's also helped because the court has a lot more programming than it used to have. When I started, we didn't have any specialty courts. And for the folks that are out there that don't know what a specialty court is, these are courts that are set up to deal with people that are charged with crimes that have specific problems. So there's often people coming in the system because they have mental health issues. There's a mental health court. We have a drug court for people that have drug issues and abuse issues. We have a veterans court for people that have a veterans background, that maybe something from their war experience has led them to get off the grid and be charged with criminal offenses. We have a catch court, which is set up for for women that were charged with the solicitation or prostitution, and many of these people are actually victims of human trafficking. So there's programming set up in place because the goal is to get these people to get help, not just for them. Because I always have, if I have more conservative people, I'm like, you're letting people off the hook. I'm like, no, we're saving you tax dollars. Helping people to not come back to court is actually, in my mind, a conservative answer. It's not a liberal answer. It's a win-win for everyone. Because if we can get somebody who comes to the system, one, they stop coming. And two, if they can become a productive member, they're paying taxes, they got a job, they got all these things. That should be the goal. Because again, with misdemeanors, you can stack misdemeanors. The most I can get somebody in jail for is 1.5 years. And after that, they're going to be back in your community. That's all we can do with the misdemeanor. So we have to try to use that. There's some people, or the other thing is, let's say you're a chronic shoplifter. You've shoplifted 20 or 30 times, but the latest thing you stole is like valued at $20. It costs over $70 a day at least to keep somebody in jail. How much of our resources? I often would speak at community groups, and the folks would always say, "Why aren't these people getting, more and more time in jail?" And I'm like, "How much more do you? If we had that solution that you're hoping for, how much more are you willing to pay in taxes? Because it's going to cost a certain amount of money to keep those folks incarcerated. It's a balancing act. I always say it's a carrot and stick. There are some people we can try to get out of the system, and there's others we're just going to continue to see. I used to be able to go to the courthouse and I could speak to certain defendants when they're going in and out because I'd had them on cases so many times. I knew who they were.
Thank you. You've been practicing in municipal court throughout your career. What made you decide to go and seek to become a judge?
Well, the judge I'm actually running for is municipal court. So it is the area where I have the most experience. I did run for judge before in 2004. I ran for common pleas, which was the more serious end. Obviously, I didn't succeed. I'm a one in belief that you're going to be where you're supposed to be. And for me, ultimately, I think not winning that race was probably a good thing because I much prefer the type of things that I'm doing now. I like to think all the years of experience that I have, I'm ready to make that next step because I've always wanted to be a judge. But I think my practical experiences, I think my reputation in the courthouse is really good. I'm respected by prosecutors. I'm respected by defense attorneys. I'm the one person, I've actually run into defendants on the streets and they're nice to me. When I ran in 2004, one of my volunteers was handing out literature and he actually encountered a person and said, "That guy put me in jail, but I think he was fair to me. I'm going to vote for him." So they took the literature. So I think these things that I've learned would be really good on the bench. I also think it's a new challenge for me. I've been doing what I've been doing for so long. We all reach a point, I'm like, it's time to make that next step and it's time to do something else. And I'm ready to do something else. And I think this is a good challenge. I think I can still learn a lot from it, but I also think what I know will be helpful to me as well.
Thank you. People know you for fairness, even those who have been on the other side. That's a very good attribute. Everyone has stories to tell, and the stories that we have shapes our beliefs, our temperament, and the way we see things. What are those personal qualities that you have that you believe that will help you to be an impartial judge?
Well, I actually think one of the things, I didn't come from a rich background, and I actually have, I myself have I have family members that are involved in the criminal justice system. So being a prosecutor is not the end that my family background would be. I've had first cousins that were incarcerated. I've had close family members that have had issues. So I think that background has allowed me to understand the drugs and alcohol and other issues sometimes are also an underlying issues with crime. Whereas I think someone maybe if they don't have that background, maybe not have the same level empathy. So I think empathy is one of the things I bring. I also tell people, no, I have the ability. I mean, we sort of used it when we did that, when I highlighted people. I can be tough if I need to be. I believe in the carrot, but sometimes you're going to have to be more forceful with some individuals. I'm committed to fairness. I'm committed to try to treat people with respect. I think I try to treat every person I encounter the same. If it's a colleague that's a lawyer versus someone out from the building that I don't know who just might be a street person, I try to treat everyone the same. And I'd like to think I would do that as a judge. The other thing is I understand that I'm not perfect. And I think as a judge, you should not be set in your ways and you got to be open. And I think I'm open. I've always maintained an open door as a prosecutor. I would do that as a judge. And my work's important to me. So I've told everyone, if I ever reach the point in my career where I'm coming into work and I'm just doing the job, but I don't care, it's time to leave. And I do care. And I do want to do the right things. And I recognize it's not always going to be perfect. But anyone who appears before me knows I'm always going to try to put in my best effort. And it's important. Every case is important to me and how I treat people. I also tell people there is no price you can put on kindness. There's nothing wrong with being kind to people. There are circumstances people don't deserve kindness. That's when it's most important to try to be kind and to treat people well. Maybe they've just never been treated decently before.
Yeah, openness and the willingness to adapt and evolve shines through even the way you answer some of these questions. So, what advice will you have for a young attorney or a young prosecutor who is just starting off and hopes to have a good career like you?
I think, particularly I've been fortunate. I worked in an office where you had a lot of freedom. So I've been fortunate, and I worked for really good people. I mean, for instance, when I started out, the chief prosecutor was Steve McIntosh, who is now known. He's a common pleas judge. He's very well respected. So I was always lucky. I had really good role models and people that cared about their jobs, were just good people. So I think it's important if you can find wherever you work, you can find some people that also fit in that mold. Because when you start, you need to go to others for advice. I mean, I'm not who I am. I'm who I've worked with. I'm who I've seen. I've picked up things from good attributes, I think, from a lot of people I've worked with. And I think that's important that you look what others do and you try to see what fits for you and attach yourself to those things. But you also need to do things that are unique to yourself. And you also need to question, what am I doing here? What do I hope to accomplish? There are some people, and there are different ways of being a good prosecutor. I know some prosecutors that are outstanding in a courtroom, and that is their strong suit. They're fine with the people part, but they're good at the courtroom part. I was more of the people person and less of the litigation person. And, the perfect package is where you can do both. And I think that's difficult. But I think what you do is you find your areas of strength and you use those and you try to cover the areas where you're not as strong. And you just go in each day and there's some days that are going to be rough. So again, as I said earlier, if you reach the point where you're like, I don't want to do this anymore, or it's not important to me, then maybe you need to look at doing something else. A lot of people, it's just, a couple of years. And then we've had a lot of people in our office, this is what they've done for 15, 20, 25 years, and they still do it very well. So I think each person can find out on their own what's important to them and do those things.
Thank you. You've highlighted some of your great attributes, which are kindness, empathy, openness, fairness, and the willingness to evolve. Are those the qualities that you would like voters to remember when they go to the polls? Or do you have anything else to add?
I think that's a lot of the attribute, but also the attribute that, I'm willing to get my hands dirty. I'm willing to do the work. I'm a hired worker. I always tell people, even with my college degrees I've got, those weren't because I was just naturally smart. I had to work really hard. I didn't have some of the advantages. I realized that also in law school when I said, look, I decided I wasn't going to be top of the class after being there, because I looked at my fellow classmates, and frankly, some of them, they had better educational backgrounds from me and background, and that gap was just there. So I had to make up the difference with work. And that's what I've continued to do. And that's what I plan on continuing to do as judge. I'm going to put in the work. I'm going to be in there early, and I will be there until we are done and we need to do the things we need to do. And it's an important job. I also take it seriously. The voters have elected me to do this job. So I'm going to try to look out for the interest for everyone. That also, as I stressed before too, even though I've stressed these things, working with people on programming, there are some times I'm going to have to make some tough decisions. And I may not be nice. And I have to have the ability to not be nice. And I also have to remember we have victims too. And I'm also going to be looking out for the interests of those people. So it's a constant balancing act.
Thank you. How can people reach you?
Well, they can, my personal email is B_Hedrick, that's HEDRICK @msn.com. Or you can also reach my website, hedrickforjudge.com. And then I also welcome people, particularly to go to my judge's Facebook page. That is Bill Hedrick for Judge. Also, my personal Facebook page is Bill R. Hedrick. Now, I prefer the Hedrick for Judge site, but I also I accept friend requests from Bill R. Hedrick. The only thing I always tell people, the only limitation is, the problem is when you're on Facebook, a lot of people think that you're a free lawyer. And obviously, I'm not covered by malpractice insurance, and I cannot give out legal advice. So I always tell people, when you have a free lawyer, you get what you paid for. It's worth what you paid for. So I'm always willing to answer questions. I'm always accessible. I even meet with people. But if people have questions, particularly on my judgeship or other things, I'm more than happy. You can contact me by any of those things. And I do my best to personally answer those questions if I can. Some questions can't just be answered, though. You sometimes have to have a conversation. So, but those are the easiest ways to get a hold of me. But again, I stress, no free legal advice.
Thank you, Bill, for coming into Legal Angle.
Thank you.
Thank you. And for those watching and those listening, thank you for joining us on this episode. Until next time, stay safe.